little over a year ago, we started presenting this theme, which we're going to talk about today, which is America 250. And we started that really with a understanding that the semi-quincentennial would be a watershed moment for us from a cultural standpoint to really be able to present these ideas of what makes America special. Now remember, at that time, we did not have a clear understanding of who the President of the United States was going to be, because the election had not yet taken place. I think what we've seen in the short period of time that we've had a new president inaugurated, it's a lightning speed of what's happening. So if you can put yourself in the mindset of where we were a year ago, and at that time we went to fundamental first principles and foundations. We had Patrick Lawrence come out and give us a talk about the Declaration of Independence and how important that particular document was, how special it is for us even today, 250 years ago, 250 years later, to understand that we hold these truths to be self-evident is as critical now as ever. It's important for us to go back and understand that 250 years ago, these men who articulated what it was not only to be human, but what it is to be free, and where those freedoms come from, we have to continue to educate and re-educate and to remind. So we went through the Declaration presentation with Patrick, then we did a table read on the Constitution so that we could understand the separation of powers and how this government operates. And then we brought in from the Nixon Library the curator for the Nixon Library and what their presentation on America 250 would be. And he gave us a little preview of what that was going to be. I'm happy to say that that exhibit will be opening on the 24th of November. So like it's important to go to the Shroud Center experience at Christ Cathedral, it's also important for us to go to the Nixon Library America 250 presentation and take people with us, particularly young people and confused or uneducated people, because they've been robbed of the beauty of a good education, a good formation. And so today we're going to be following up on what we talked about in September, where we talked about the voyage of discovery and the age of discovery, in which we talked about the three European powers: the Spanish Empire, who Christopher Columbus was sailing for and discovered this new world, and then went about the conquistadores and the conflict with the indigenous people, and then the miraculous experience of Our Lady of Guadalupe in 1531 and what that did to evangelization in North America from Mexico north to the southern United States. We talked about the France and its exploration through the Hudson Bay area, coming down through the Great Lakes and then down through the Mississippi River, all the way ultimately into what were parts of Texas and Alabama and Tennessee and Louisiana. And then we talked a little bit about that. It wasn't an empire at that point, it was a kingdom of England that was colonizing what became the 13 colonies. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, from colonies to constitution. So with that framework of understanding the three great powers there and how much of it was influenced by the Spanish Empire, it's important for us to kind of put a context to the British colonial experience in the United States and why that was different. The Spanish came, they conquered, they brought people from Spain to rule. They established trade, a trade route that went from Manila to Spain and back and forth. They came for God, for glory, and for gold. The French sent Jesuits, missionaries, to share the good news with people who had never heard of Jesus Christ. They didn't send colonizers. They sent some fur traders and some explorers. But for the most part, they sent Jesuit missionaries who would come and live amongst the indigenous people, learn their language, their customs, their songs, their food, their ways, document that by learning their languages and alphabetizing it, sending it back to France to educate other Jesuit missionaries who would later come and take their place. And the British experience, the English experience, was to export people, particularly those that they found troublesome in the home island, because remember they were going through a Protestant Reformation at that time period, establishing their own religion, the Church of England with the king as its head. So there's a great deal of tension that was taking place. in England. And so exporting people that they found troublesome politically was a policy of the British government at that time. In the year 1776, when the revolution took place here, do you know how many people there were in the British colonies, in those 13 colonies? 2.5 million people. In the New Spain, which is what Mexico became, the non-indigenous people, there were just about 1 million Spaniards. In New France, which is what Canada became, 16,000 Frenchmen. Think about that for a minute. 16,000 European French in what we now call Canada, 1 million in a vast territory that went all from the Yucatan all the way up into Alta California and all the way across to Florida and all of the southern states. That was all part of New Spain at that particular time. And in the 13 British colonies along the Atlantic seaboard, 2.5 million people. So that kind of gives you some context for the impact of culture and evangelization and colonization, conquest, evangelization, and how the three different kingdoms went about it. The Spanish obviously have the most influential empire at that time period, the late 15th century through the 16th century. The British were an emerging power. The French were an established power that had more of a laissez-faire type approach to the colonization of the North American continent. But we're going to talk about these three colonizers in the context of our talk today. The Spanish, from 1500 to 1763, 320 years. New France, Canada, 1534 to 1763, 230 years. The British North American experience, 1607 to 1783, 180 years. Spain, France, England. It's important for us to understand that because we're talking about Catholics in America. The British at that time period had some Catholics, but they were not a Catholic country at that time period. Spaniards, an empire, a Christian Catholic nation. France, a kingdom, a Catholic kingdom. In the Spanish population of 1 million, 99.9% of them were Roman Catholic. Of the 16,000 Frenchmen, 99.9% of them Catholic. Of the 2.5 million British subjects in 1776, how many of them do you think were Catholic?
Less than 1%?
25,000.
In Maryland, primarily.
Yeah. Think about that, 1%. Now think about America today. We're in a moment of Catholic ascendancy. The Supreme Court, 7 of 9 are either Catholic or baptized Catholic. Gorsuch converted to Episcopalianism. Everyone else on the Catholic majority maintained it. The Vice President of the United States, Catholic. The First Lady, Catholic. The immediate past president, Catholic. There is a...
You're being kind.
No, he's a Catholic.
He was asleep.
He's a Catholic. I didn't say he was a good Catholic. I just said he was Catholic. The time of anti-Catholicism is well past in the United States. And I say that because for us, it's critically important to understand the responsibility that we have as Catholics in the marketplace. When Bishop Barron spoke to the Orange Catholic Foundation's Conference on Business and Ethics 7 years ago, he used the Matthew Kelly study. You know the Matthew Kelly study from Dynamic Catholic? Cardinal George, when he was the president of the USCCB, did not trust the numbers that were coming out of Georgetown, a Catholic university, in terms of Catholic life in America. So he gave Matthew Kelly's organization $1 million to look at Catholicism in America. So Dynamic Catholic sent out a countrywide survey asking people what their level of engagement was with their Catholic identity. And their definition of a highly engaged Catholic was that you went to Mass at least 3 times per month. Now, last time I checked, there was more than 3 Sundays in a month. But if you go at least 3 times per month and you're engaged in at least 2 activities in your parish, that might be the choir, that might be helping at altar, that might be sending your kids to the parish school, whatever it was. Knights of Columbus, membership, maybe not participation, but that would count. And so they did all the data, and they crunched the numbers, and this is what they found. Now, most of us that are in a business understand there's an 80-20 rule. Does anybody, can they articulate the 80-20 rule for our young students here? What's the 80-20 rule? Mark?
80% of your business comes from 20% of the people you know.
Absolutely. 20% provide 80% of the productivity. 20% of the employees provide 80% of the productivity, 80-20 rule. In the Catholic Church in the United States, we do not have an 80-20 experience. We don't have a 10-9 experience. According to Matthew Kelly's study of highly engaged Catholics being what? 3 masses per month and at least 2 activities in the parish, there are 7% of Catholics doing the majority of the work. This study is over 12 years old, and at that time, of the 7%, 50% were over the age of 65. 12 years ago, this is pre-COVID lockdown shutdown. 12 years ago, 50% of the 7% of Catholics who identified, 73 million Catholics identified as Catholic in America, a country of 330 million people. That means that less than 3 million people under the age of 65 are the ones holding the culture together, as Bishop Barron said. Because he said only Catholicism is an integrated system of moral life that is a consistent ethic from conception to natural death. Whether you're a good Catholic that understands it, or you're not necessarily a Catholic that agrees with the teachings of life, Bishop Barron was saying, we're it. We are the firewall of the collapse of civilization. So as Catholics, we need to not only understand our faith, but as Catholics in America, we need to understand our responsibilities to be able to articulate that in the free expression that our Constitution allows. The Constitution is the rules of the game, and we need to understand the rules of the game so that we can play it at the highest level that we're called to as well-formed Catholics in America at this time. So, Spanish, New France, British. The Catholic experience, much of what we experience obviously here in California, has its roots in Spanish colonialism. I want to talk about a few people that are representative of the Spanish, the French, and then we'll get into the British experience in terms of Catholics in America. But before I do, I want to just, again, reemphasize why this is so important. In California, in the United States of America, every state is invited to send 2 statues from its state to the federal Capitol building in Statuary Hall, and those figures that most represent your particular state. Has anybody ever been into Statuary Hall in the Capitol building? It's one of the really inspiring things. And if we don't understand and remember our history, it's easy for us to get confused. Here's a good point. California sent 2 statues to the federal government. One was Junipero Serra, Catholic saint, and we constantly have to fight to preserve his presence there. Does anybody know who the other original statue was? His name was Thomas Starr King. When California came into the Union, it had a decision to make. Was it going to be a free state or was it going to be a slave state? It's part of the Missouri Compromise. And so there had to be a plebiscite in California for them to determine free or slave. Thomas Starr King was a Methodist circuit riding preacher who rode up and down the state, imploring people for California to come into the Union as a free state. And by a slimmest of majorities, that happened. Now, shortly after California came into the Union, a big conflict took place called the American Civil War. At that time period, the wealth that was coming out of Nevada and the Sierra Nevadas through San Francisco was an overwhelming. It was the tech explosion of this time. The Comstock lode was a huge source of revenue. Had California come in as a slave state, those dollars would have gone to support the Confederacy, which could have been the difference in power, the balance of power. So again, these things move in history, just in the most subtle ways of destiny, right? Thomas Starr King, which in 1850 was the difference between what would happen in 1865. We knew this history in California, so we sent a statue of him to Statuary Hall, where it was until about 9-10 years ago. 9 or 10 years ago, the California legislature, in a misguided move, removed his statue from Statuary Hall and had it sent back to California to be boxed up. It's somewhere in California in the archives. Do you know who we replaced the statue with?
That Newsom.
He'd like to be the one that replaces Junipero Serra. No, we replaced him with Ronald Reagan. Now, this is a misguided aspect of our history. Reagan, great president. Son of California? No, son of Illinois. But misguidedness, because we don't understand our history, is why it's so important for us to understand America 250, what's taking place here, this semi-quincentennial, and go beyond anything we talk about today. We need to study it, we need to download it, we need to do our research, we got to share the good news, all right? So I use that as an aside just to remind us why this is so important for us. If we don't know our history, we'll make terrible decisions about our present, which will impact our future. All right, Catholics in the colonies. New France. Hudson's Bay Company comes into the Sea of St. Lawrence, comes down around into the Great Lakes, moves its way down to the Mississippi River. 1642 to 1649, there were 8 people who were martyred. We call them the North American martyrs. We celebrate them in our liturgy. 6 of the 8 were Catholic priests. They were Jesuits. 2 of them were lay ministers that helped them. Now remember, the philosophy for France wasn't to send colonizers, it was to send missionaries. And these men would study the language, eat the food, live in the villages, get to know them. And this is a warlike people. These indigenous people of what we call the Iroquois Confederation, the Algonquins, the Mohawks, etc. They were a warlike, vicious people. And they weren't quite necessarily accepting of this new God. And so these missionaries, in a heroic way, continue to be present. Father, St. Isaac Jogues, as he celebrated Mass, he required what? His fingers and his thumbs to elevate the host. So what did they decide to do to get rid of the power of this God?
Off with his thumbs.
They ate his thumbs off so that he couldn't celebrate the Mass. In terrible suffering, he went back to France, received special permission from the Holy Father for him able to go back so that he could celebrate the Mass using his fingers. It required papal dispensation because at that time, a disfigured priest was not allowed to celebrate the Mass. But again, think about the commitment that it took. And for that effort, he was later burned at the stake. St. Isaac Jogues. John de Brebeuf. Those are the 2 names that we always remember. Here are the other names. Father Noel Charbonnel. Father Antoine Daniel. Father Charles Garnier. Father Gabriel Lallemand. Those are the priests. The lay people, René Goupil, Jean de Lalande, Jean de Lalande. Those are the names we never hear when we celebrate the North American martyrs, which is one of our great shrines. Has anybody ever had a chance to make pilgrimage to the North American martyrs? I haven't. It's up near Buffalo, past Buffalo. Heroic names, Catholics in America. Because of their efforts as evangelists, this next person came to know the Lord. Her name was Saint Kateri Tekakwitha, the Lily of the Mohawks. Now, she was a convert to Catholicism, and accepting the Catholic faith was ostracized by her people. and was shunned, ridiculed, made to suffer. Yet she suffered out of joy for the Lord. A woman who was disfigured by smallpox, not the most attractive of people to be the lily of the Mohawks, but sure, her beauty shined from within. She died at the age of 24 and was so revered that her people converted to Catholicism through her example, her witness. One of the miraculous things that took place upon her death is that her smallpox scars disappeared. She appeared 3 times post-death to different people in the area. God allowing this miracle to take place to inspire others so that the Catholic faith would take root amongst the indigenous people. St. Kateri Tekakwitha, Catholic in America. Over in New Spain, we want to talk about a few names. Some are saints. We'll talk about 2 men. One is a saint, one's not. Both are from Majorca, Spain. Both were Franciscan priests. Both came to Mexico. Both were evangelists. One's name we are well acquainted with, which is St. Junipero Serra. St. Junipero taught in the Franciscan seminary in Majorca, had a tremendous career as a scholar there and formator of young Franciscans. And then he came to Mexico, where he worked for another 10 years in Mexico City, baptizing, sharing the faith, teaching in the college seminary there. And then something took place, which was really geopolitics. The king of Spain at that time, Carlos III, was not happy with the Jesuit method of missionizing the Spanish Empire of New Spain at that time. So he took the Jesuit missions away from them in Baja California. Now at this time period, which is in the 1760s, incursion is starting to take place with other European nations. The British were sailing into the Pacific. The Russians were coming down. They were establishing some settlements in San Francisco. And so King Carlos wanted to preserve the Pacific coast for Spain, which had been there for 250 years. So he sent Junipero Serra first to stabilize the missions in Baja California, and then to go to Mission San Diego de Alcala, which is in San Diego now, and then from there reach out into Alta California to explore and establish mission outposts so that the Spanish claims of what would become California, what was then Alta California, would be protected. So Junipero Serra went by sea and he sailed from San Diego up into the San Francisco Bay. But his friend, Father Juan Crespi, left San Diego as part of the Portola expedition, and he walked from San Diego to Monterey Bay in search of that deep water port that they knew which was there. And as they went, 50 soldiers, Gaspar de Portola, Father Juan Crespi, and Father Francisco Guzman, 2 Franciscan friars, they were the presence of God for the company. Can you imagine walking through California for the first time, not knowing what you would find, if they would be friendly indigenous people or hostile indigenous people, but your job was to encounter them, to share with them, to trade with them, most importantly, to introduce them to God. And the cities that we now have in California mostly were laid out on that Portola expedition. I'm sorry Dan isn't here because he's always an excellent source of information on talking about the Portola expedition. One of the amazing things was they walked from San Diego to Monterey Bay and they couldn't find the bay, so they turned around and went back to San Diego, and they kept all of this in the diaries of their journey. And when they got back to San Diego, they said, well, you missed it. You needed to just keep going over that hill, and that's where it was. Why don't you go back? And they made him walk again until they found it. Talk about men. I mean, we've walked from the retreat center to Christ Cathedral downhill. It's no fun. Jeff's walked uphill over the mountains. He made it. There are people in this room who couldn't make that journey. It was just too difficult. On that 106-degree day, we did it. Father Juan Crespi. Now, what's interesting about Father Crespi and His Holiness, a Catholic in the colonies, Colonies of New Spain, but colonies. When Junipero Serra died, he died 10 years after his friend, Father Juan Crespi. As he was dying, he said, "My desire is to be buried within arm's length of Father Crespi's grave." Such was his holiness. So Saint Junipero, who we hold in high esteem as the founder of California, the great saint of California, held Father Crespi in even higher esteem. If you go to the Mission San Carlos Borromeo in Carmel, you'll see the cenotaph for Junipero Serra. It's beautiful. Has the California bear at his feet. But it's within arm's distance in the sanctuary of San Carmel where Father Crespi is buried. Part of our California history, part of our Catholics in America, American history. All right, that's the Spanish, that's the French. Let's talk about a few Anglo-Catholics in America. There was one signer of the Declaration of Independence who was Catholic. Who can name him?
John Carroll.
Who?
John Carroll.
Incorrect. Who? Charles Carroll of Carrollton.
The bishop, yeah.
Now before we get to Charles Carroll of Carrollton, we first have to go through and understand how it is that Catholics came to the colonies in the first place. Now remember, the original colonization of the United States started with Jamestown. And Jamestown was founded in 1602, was named for James I, a Stuart king. After that, the Puritans came in 1620. 13 years later, they established the Massachusetts Bay Colony, first landing at Cape Cod, then at Plymouth. They went through the brutal winter. When they left Holland, they left England, they went to Holland to try and establish a Puritan colony there, only to find that the Dutch weren't really welcoming their customs, their culture. They didn't like it, so they had this idea that they would go to the New World instead. They would brave the Atlantic, which in 1620 was no easy thing to do. They left in two ships, the Mayflower and the Speedwell. The Speedwell immediately sprang leaks, and so the passengers, 60 passengers on the Speedwell, had to be transferred over to the Mayflower, a ship that had 60 people in its company. And so now we had very tight quarters on the Mayflower that made the journey. Half of the people that made the journey across the Atlantic in the Mayflower died, either of scurvy or later starvation once they had weighed anchor in the Bay Colony. From there, they had to make an effort to establish a presence on land in winter, where they had to build their dwellings in a very hostile winter climate. No easy task. John Winthrop was the leader of the expedition. Another half of those died of starvation or scurvy that first winter. Later, obviously, through the efforts of an Indian who spoke English, his name was Squanto, was able to act as interpreter and establish relations between the indigenous people and what was left of that original Puritan experience. And that allowed them to plant, and then that allowed them to hunt, and that allowed them to establish a base from which the Massachusetts Bay Colony would grow. And that happened in 1620. The colony of Maryland was established in 1635 as a refuge for Catholics who were being persecuted in England to come to the New World to establish a presence. At the same time, in what became known as Pennsylvania, a Quaker colony was established. So this religious persecution and tension that was happening in the English home islands was motivating people to come across a harrowing Atlantic journey by sail, risking starvation and scurvy. That's how motivated they were to leave where they were. So the first Lord Baltimore established Maryland in 1635. The first Lord Baltimore did not come to Maryland. He was established his seat, which was in York in northern England, Catholic, and he was a member of Parliament. And so he had negotiated the charter that established this private colony for Catholics to be able to go to. So the first Catholics that came to Maryland landed in the Chesapeake Bay and established themselves on the eastern shore. And the people were so happy to be there because they were establishing something new that would provide religious freedom for them as Catholics. Shortly thereafter landed Charles Carroll, the settler. Charles Carroll, the settler, was the grandfather of Charles Carroll of Carrollton. Charles Carroll, the settler, was from Dublin originally, an educated man who came to London to make his fortune. He made his fortune the way many people did at that time. He married it. He married a wealthy, land-owning woman of British aristocracy, who also was Catholic. And she died. And so he took that wealth and, under the patronage of the First Lord Baltimore, came to St. Mary's Town, which was the first town established in Maryland, and there established himself as the first Attorney General of the new colony, where he established land that would become plantations. And he expanded his wealth the old-fashioned way. He married it. So he married another wealthy woman, took her plantation lands, doubled and tripled his fortune, and established his line in Maryland. When he died, his son, Charles Carroll of Annapolis, became influential in that legislature. However, by that time period, Protestants had invaded into Maryland and through democratic legislature replaced the Catholics and made it illegal for Catholics to hold public office in that colony, which had been established for religious freedom and toleration. So the intolerant Protestants eliminated the ability for Catholics to hold office. So he spent his time expanding his wealth, his plantations, which at that time, landed gentry was how you expanded your wealth, because there was not a lot of currency for financial advisors to advise. And so what they did was they took raw products, sent them on ships back to the mother country where they were manufactured, and under letters of credit established themselves. And this is how commerce was done in the colonial period. Charles Carroll of Annapolis had a son. His name was Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who was the wealthiest man in the colonies, even more so than George Washington. For him to sign the Declaration of Independence, one of 56 people who did, the only Catholic, was for him to sign his death warrant should the revolution not prevail. Now, at that time period, there were how many people in the colonies, in the British colonies? 2.5 million. Of those 2.5 million, how many were enslaved people? About 500,000. So of the 2 million people that were not enslaved, how many of them supported the revolution? About a third. A third of them were so integrated with the mother country, they had no interest in revolution because they had done well and were doing well. So they were loyalist, which left a third in between, kind of trying to figure out what was going to happen during the revolution. So for Charles Carroll, a Catholic in the colony, to sign his name to that Declaration of Independence not only took tremendous courage, but also belief in the core teachings of what it is to be Catholic, which is the dignity of each and every human being made in God's image and likeness, as expressed in that document. Amazing Catholic in America. Charles Carroll had a cousin, 2 cousins actually. One was named Father John Carroll. The other one was Daniel Carroll II. Daniel Carroll II was one of 2 Catholics to sign the Constitution of the United States. The other, Thomas Fitzsimmons. Catholics in the colonies, Catholics in America. Daniel Carroll II, Thomas Fitzsimmons, Charles Carroll. Men of tremendous property, wealth. This would be the equivalent of Bezos or Gates, risking everything for moral courage, for the belief in, I don't know, pro-life, something that would cause you to be arrested, incarcerated, maybe killed as traitors. Tremendous moral courage. Father John Carroll, his story is perhaps one of the most inspiring. At the time period, how many Catholics were there in British North America? 25,000? Handful of priests, very few. John Carroll was educated in Reims, France, as was Charles Carroll of Carrollton, by the Jesuits in the secondary school and then the collegiate level. John Carroll then went on to the seminary where he was ordained a Jesuit priest. Came back to the colonies where he worked pastorally as a Jesuit priest. And then because of what was happening in France and England and Spain, he left the Jesuit order. There wasn't really a Jesuit presence in the British colonies. And so he became a secularized priest, which meant that he did not belong to a religious community anymore. He was an independent priest whose means were his own, and he reported to his bishop, who at that time was in France, I believe. So he was pretty much a lone operator in the continent. Educated man from a wealthy family, obviously influential. At one point, the American founders, the revolutionaries, were so hopeful that the Catholics of Quebec would come in support of the revolutionary effort that they sent Benjamin Franklin as an emissary to go treat with them. Do you know who he took with him? Father John Carroll. They did not prevail, but that's the esteem with which the American founders held Father John Carroll, a Catholic in the colonies at a time period when Catholics weren't necessarily understood or appreciated. After the Revolution, John Carroll went about establishing the church in the United States. He became our first bishop. He established his see at Baltimore. Baltimore was the proto-diocese of all of what became the United States of America. And from there, he had to establish seminaries, place for priest training. He established the first university in Catholic university in the United States. Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. was established by Bishop John Carroll, later to be Archbishop John Carroll. We just had the bishops gathering for their annual conference. Do we know where they did the plenary or the bishops conference this week? We just elected a new president of the USCCB. Does anybody know where it was at? Baltimore, exactly. So Baltimore, for us Catholics, tremendous place of pilgrimage. If you ever have an opportunity to go back east and visit the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, which is on the campus of Catholic University of America, try and make it over into Baltimore and pray in the proto-cathedral there. Because it's a testament to the importance of Catholicism in America from the earliest time period. Catholics in the colonies, from colonies to Constitution. So, why do we remember these stories? Why do we talk about these men? Because we're privileged to live here in 2025 on the cusp of what will be 2026, when we will be celebrating the semi-quincentennial anniversary. It's important for us to know our history as Americans. It's important for us to understand as American Catholics that is not rooted in the British Protestant history that's taught to us in many of our school books that we grew up learning in the public schools. Much of it's rooted in that Spanish exploration that first came with Christopher Columbus sailing for Spain, then Cortez and conquering the Mexican Isthmus of Mexico, and then conquering Moctezuma and establishing Catholicism there to eliminate human sacrifice, which was their practice. It was there that Our Lady of Guadalupe was sent by God the Father to share with people the fact that this Christian God really is God. And this amazing number of conversions that took place in the 10 years after 1531, 9 million Christian baptisms at a time when Protestant Reformation was taking 5 million Christians out of the Catholic Church. It's important to understand the efforts of those that colonized St. Augustine, Florida, 1605, Santa Fe, New Mexico, the exploration that took place in Kansas all the way up into Colorado and Nevada, those Spanish explorers that brought priests with them, that shared the faith, that suffered. Many of those were lost explorations, people that died on the way and we never heard from again. But again, this is heroic stuff. The people that went and evangelized New France. Imagine being Jacques Marquette with Joliet and paddling in Indian canoes and having to portage it up over falls and then go down, move through the Great Lakes. Gil's from Detroit. He knows what that area is like. What was it like to go from what became Chicago, Detroit, to come all the way down the Mississippi River? This is heroic stuff, carried by faith, absolute belief in God that He was with us. We don't know what the next 250 years are going to be, what the next 25 minutes are going to be. But we know that we've been formed as Catholics for a time such as this. And as we move in next month and pick up the next story of Catholics in America, we're going to welcome Chris Weir, the headmaster from the Camino Schools, who's doing an amazing job helping to renew Catholic education here in Orange County and other places, so the inspiration of what they're doing there. And he's going to be talking to us about the importance of Catholic education through the experience of two American saints, Elizabeth and Bailey Seton, and Bishop John Neumann. Because it's through their efforts that the parochial school system as we grew up in was established. And we're going to leave that for next time when Chris comes to talk to us. I thank you for your attention. Hopefully we inspired one or two of you. And again, get to the Nixon Library, go see the exhibit there, America 250, go online, learn about this thing, share the good news of what it is to be Catholic in America. Thank you.